Hi everyone, my name is Abhuraj Garikapati. Welcome to my YouTube channel Amazing Abhi. That he might not even be capable of defeating a cheap imitation was something Gashar absolutely refused to accept. Yet, deep down, he couldn't ignore the possibility that it might actually be true. That realization humbled him just enough to cast aside his pride. If brute force wasn't enough to overcome this monster, then he'd simply use every trump card he had been hiding until now. Launching himself into the air, Gashar immediately unleashed another shadow sword-slaying art. Countless waves of sword energy rained down from above as he repeatedly fired Ink Orchid, blanketing ZY with attack after attack. The giant servitor didn't even bother moving from his position. Instead, he casually spun his massive warhammer in front of himself. Despite its absurd size, he wielded it as effortlessly as if it weighed no more than a feather, effortlessly deflecting every incoming blade of sword energy. The barrage accomplished nothing. Eventually, Gashar stopped attacking, prompting ZY to lower his hammer. Looking up at the air candidate, he mockingly called him pathetic and challenged him to dig deeper if that was truly the best Ragnar had to offer. Gashar wasn't offended in the slightest. In fact, the taunt only confirmed that everything was unfolding exactly as planned. The relentless Ink Orchid barrage had never been his real attack. Without hesitation, dark ink-like chains suddenly erupted from Gashar's body. They extended in every direction before anchoring themselves into the ground, with shadow-forged blades buried deep beneath the earth. The intricate technique wrapped itself around ZY from every angle, locking the massive servitor firmly in place. It was another shadow sword-slaying art cosmic web. At first glance, it appeared as though the enormous warrior was genuinely struggling against the restraints. Even so, ZY couldn't help finding the technique laughable. He questioned whether the brat seriously believed a flimsy web of chains could hold someone like him. Gashar calmly admitted that cosmic web alone would never be enough to restrain a monster of ZY's caliber. But that was perfectly fine, because keeping ZY trapped had never been his true objective. Instead of remaining on the ground, Gashar lightly stepped onto the ink chains themselves, using them as footholds to keep his body suspended above the battlefield. Growing tired of the endless tricks, ZY flexed his overwhelming strength and effortlessly shattered the entire cosmic web in a single burst of power. Exactly as Gashar intended, the instant every chain snapped apart, the second stage of the technique activated. The shattered restraints triggered a violent chain reaction, erupting into a massive explosion that buried ZY beneath an enormous avalanche of broken rock and rubble. Meanwhile, Theo's battle had progressed just as dramatically. Ever since activating Dragonization, he had become noticeably more comfortable fighting in his transformed state. With his enhanced speed and strength now completely under control, he steadily overwhelmed Dree until the speedy servitor could no longer keep up. One decisive exchange left both of her arms crippled, robbing her of the greatest weapon she possessed. With her unable to resist effectively, Theo restrained her by binding her to the surrounding debris, scattered across the battlefield. Despite having every opportunity to finish her off, he deliberately chose not to. Instead, he decided to keep her alive. He had already promised his commander that he would return from this mission with his hands full, and delivering a living servitor as a prisoner would make an excellent gift for the demon dragon. Hearing those words, something unexpected happened inside Dree. Her black heart skipped a beat, completely misunderstanding Theo's intentions. She found herself captivated by what she interpreted as both his overwhelming strength and his kindness, even though, in reality, Theo wasn't trying to be sweet at all. After securing Dree, Theo finally shifted his attention to the other side of the battlefield. He couldn't help wondering how his so-called big brother was holding up against Servitor number 2. Before he could gather his thoughts for long, the answer revealed itself. ZY had already clawed his way out from beneath the mountain of rubble created by Gishar's trap. The elaborate explosion had buried him, but it clearly hadn't been enough to keep the monstrous servitor down for long. Dust and shattered stone rolled off his massive frame, as though nothing significant had happened. At that exact moment, Gishar struck again. Appearing seemingly out of nowhere, he descended from above at the perfect angle, aiming to catch ZY before he could fully recover. The giant's instincts immediately screamed at him. Without hesitating, Zwei raised his warhammer to intercept the surprise assault. The moment their weapons collided, Jishar refused to give him even a second to breathe. He relentlessly chained one attack into another, forcing Zwei into an intense close-quarters exchange. Shadow techniques flowed one after another, as Jishar pressed forward with frightening aggression, his twin sides dancing through the air with deadly precision. This time, unlike before, his attacks actually began breaking through. Deep wounds slowly accumulated across Zwei's enormous body, proving that even the servitor's monstrous durability had its limits. Still, Jishar wasn't satisfied. Clicking his tongue, in frustration, he realized he had gone completely all in during that last combination, yet the damage remained far smaller than he expected. Even after unleashing everything he had, he'd only barely managed to pierce Zwei's absurd defenses. Watching the battle unfold, Theo immediately understood the situation. Jishar might have finally found a way to injure the giant, but continuing alone against someone like Zwei would only become more dangerous as the fight dragged on. Deciding there was no reason to play fair against enemies like the servitors, Theo stepped forward to turn the battle into an unfair 2-against-1. Looking toward his older brother, Theo simply smiled and extended a hand not to literally pull him up, but to signal that they should fight together. Jishar instinctively clicked his tongue and threw out a few curses at the audacity of his little brother. Even so, seeing Theo standing before him in full dragonization, erased the last traces of doubt lingering in his mind. There was no denying it anymore. Theo truly was the chosen one. With complete shamelessness, Jishar declared that once these servitors were dead, their own fight would resume exactly where it had been interrupted. Theo answered with the same confident smile, calmly agreeing to the arrangement. There would be plenty of time for Ragnar blood to spill later. Right now, the traitors came first. Jishar couldn't resist mocking Theo one last time, warning him that his complacent attitude would eventually get him killed. According to his own assessment, Servitor number 2 was on an entirely different level compared to the woman Theo had reduced to an armless prisoner. Theo didn't argue in the slightest. He agreed 100%. Zwei was unquestionably the greater threat, and defeating him would require both brothers giving everything they had. Elsewhere, the Black Iron Cavalry had already begun mobilizing under the command of Theo Ragnar. Standing before his assembled troops, Theo formally announced that, according to Ragnar's sacred laws, they had been deployed to arrest Theo Ragnar under suspicion of treason. Officially, that was the mission. Personally, however, Theo didn't believe the accusation for even a second. In his eyes, Theo abandoning the Ragnar clan would be the same as denying the patriarch himself, something that simply didn't fit the younger heir's character. Even so, military law was absolute. If the accused resisted arrest, Ragnar's martial code authorized immediate execution on the spot. With those orders delivered, the Black Iron Cavalry advanced in full force toward the White Tower. News of Theo's alleged betrayal quickly reached the White Armor Dragon Cavalry, throwing the entire unit into confusion. His comrades immediately turned toward Captain Evelyn, hoping she could explain what was really happening. Before anyone could spiral into speculation, Commander Julius Ragnar, the Demon Dragon, silenced everyone with a single firm order to move out immediately. Even Evelyn found it difficult to accept lining up to capture one of their own comrades. Julius, however, dismissed the political accusations entirely. The White Armor Dragon Cavalry had never concerned itself with petty political games. Their duty was simple. They trusted their comrades, just as they always had. That trust was enough. Without another word, Evelyn followed Julius into the skies, as the entire squadron mounted their wyverns and took flight. Watching from afar, the Tyrant Dragon immediately noticed the White Armor Dragon Cavalry leaving. The sight instantly put him on edge. His expression darkened with irritation, because he knew exactly who was leading those wyverns. Julius Ragnar was the type of man who would willingly break an ancient dragon's arm just to save a single subordinate. There was absolutely no chance Julius would ever accept a conveniently abandoned uniform as undeniable proof that Theo had committed treason, nor would he voluntarily lead a pursuit squad against Ragnar's golden boy. It was obvious those flying lizards were planning something beyond their official orders, frustrated by his inability to interfere. The Tyrant Dragon crushed part of a nearby cliff with nothing but his grip, desperately resisting the urge to dive straight into the chaos himself. Back at the battlefield, Theo and Gashar found themselves with no choice but to continue fighting side by side. Gashar reminded his little brother not to underestimate Servitor number 2. Compared to Dree, Sui existed on an entirely different level. Theo quickly suggested a strategy to coordinate their attacks, but Gashar rejected the idea immediately. He hated being told what to do, especially by his younger brother. If anything, he'd rather defeat the noble servitor by himself first and then go back to killing Theo afterward. Understanding that arguing would only waste time, Theo backed off. Succession candidates possess too much pride to be ordered around. Gashar gathered his strength before disappearing from sight once again. When he reappeared, he unleashed another devastating assassination technique. Countless dark heavenly daggers surrounded Sui from every direction, cornering the giant before detonating simultaneously upon impact. Even under that relentless bombardment, Sui barely moved. Standing his ground, he smashed every incoming dagger apart with his warhammer, until the barrage finally ended. The moment the explosion stopped, Sui immediately switched to the offensive. Despite carrying an impossibly massive body and an even larger weapon, he accelerated with terrifying speed that completely defied common sense. Before we move ahead, please take a second to like on this video. A like tells me that you enjoyed this topic. Your support helps Amazing Up High grow naturally. Every swing of the Warhammer carried enough force to instantly kill anyone foolish enough to block it head-on. Gashar realized that simply defending forever would accomplish nothing. He patiently continued parrying and evading, waiting for the smallest break-in-ways stance that might create a counterattack opportunity. To make matters even more irritating, Sui mocked Gashar throughout the fight, ridiculing the so-called Gale Dragon, and daring the heir candidate to prove he deserved the title. Since Gashar insisted on fighting alone, Theo remained on the sidelines instead of interfering. As the duel dragged on longer than expected, he decided to use the downtime to question his captive. Before he could begin, another figure quietly appeared beside the restrained Dry. It was Ain, the first servitor. Speaking in a calm, almost scholarly tone, Ain admired Theo's ingenious use of his chain and dagger mechanism during the earlier battle. The moment Theo sensed Ain's presence, however, every instinct in his body screamed danger. The manner radiating from the first servitor felt overwhelmingly ominous and completely alien compared to anything he'd encountered before. Ain casually admitted that 30% of the Black Dragon's power simply wasn't enough to overcome dragonization. She explained that the 9 servitors were artificial humans created through experimentation, each designed to rival one of Ragnar's 9 dragons. Every test subject was assigned a number corresponding to its strength. As the 3rd servitor, Dry had only been implanted with roughly 30% of the Black Dragon's power. Theo couldn't help finding the entire explanation pathetic. To him, constantly measuring power and percentages sounded laughable. His dismissive reaction visibly upset Dry beneath her mask. Without showing the slightest emotion, Ain responded by pulling out an enormous syringe filled with a mysterious substance and driving it directly into Dree's neck. Panic immediately spread across the 3rd servitor's face. She desperately begged for mercy, promising she could still fight if given another chance. But Ain ignored every plea. The injected substance instantly began deforming her body in horrifying ways. Her muscles twisted, her flesh swelled uncontrollably, and after only a few agonizing moments, her body exploded in a gruesome shower of blood, organs, and shattered flesh. Ain calmly explained that the violent death had been caused by mana hole backflow, something Theo had witnessed once before. The syringe, she revealed, contained 40% of the Black Dragon's power. In truth, the servitors had already succeeded in recreating power, rivaling the original dragons. The real obstacle wasn't the power itself. It was finding a vessel capable of surviving it. Looking directly at Theo, Ain declared that Theo Ragnar would make the perfect vessel to advance her research. If he cooperated, she promised she could make him even stronger than the Patriarch himself. Their conversation was abruptly interrupted by the sounds of battle. Against all expectations, Gishar had steadily worn his way down until the hulking servitor's body was visibly damaged and stripped apart. The insane heir candidate couldn't hide his excitement as confidence surged through him. Seeing enough data had finally been gathered, Ain casually stepped in. With nothing more than a flick of a finger, she ordered Zwei to stand back up and finish the battle. Despite the punishment he had endured, the 2nd servitor rose to his feet like a mindless zombie At that exact moment, Jishar's attention shifted for only an instant. It was all Sway needed. His aura suddenly condensed into a deadly spike that shot forward and impaled Jishar before the air candidate could react. Originally, Ain's mission had been to kill Theo and seize the ancient dragon's power residing within him. With the situation changing rapidly, however, she decided she would gladly settle for capturing another succession candidate instead. Before Theo could even process what had happened, Ain melted into the surrounding darkness, while reminding him that her earlier offer still remained open. Almost simultaneously, a new presence arrived on the battlefield. Theo Ragnar had located Theo first. Reacting instantly, he hurled his spear toward Ain's escape point, nearly interrupting her teleportation. Unfortunately, the attack arrived just a fraction too late. Ain disappeared into the shadows, escaping by the narrowest possible margin. Thorkel's sudden charge had carved a massive path of destruction across the battlefield before finally coming to a stop. The ground behind him was torn apart, leaving deep trenches where his overwhelming power had ripped through the terrain. As soon as the dust settled, Theo immediately walked toward his older brother, intending to explain everything and request the formation of a pursuit squad to chase after the escaping servitors. He never got the chance before Theo could finish a single sentence. Thorkel coldly informed him that, by Ragnar law, he was officially under arrest on suspicion of treason. Moments later, the rest of the Black Iron Cavalry arrived behind their commander. Almost simultaneously, Julius Ragnar descended from the skies with the White Armor Dragon Cavalry, causing the battlefield to grow even more crowded. Two succession candidates now stood facing each other, while two elite Dragon Cavalry units watched in silence. The atmosphere instantly became suffocating, as if things weren't tense enough already. Dante Rahl, the Tyrant Dragon, arrived alongside Ancir Ragnar. The moment Antoinette scanned the battlefield, her expression changed. Gashar was nowhere to be found. Judging everything that had happened, she immediately concluded that the intervention of the 9 servitors must have complicated the battle. In the worst-case scenario, her brother had already been captured. Dante, however, showed no concern whatsoever for one of his own disciples possibly falling into enemy hands. Instead, he seemed almost pleased. Theo's situation had finally handed him the perfect excuse to crush the insolent Yelnier. Stepping forward with complete confidence, the Tyrant Dragon declared that during wartime, treason deserved only one punishment: immediate execution. Theo wanted to explain what had truly happened, but rescuing Gashar was far more urgent than defending himself. Dante wasn't interested in listening anyway. He stepped forward, clearly intending to lay hands on Theo himself. Before Dante could touch him, Julius Ragnar calmly moved between them. The demon dragon flatly refused to let anyone bully his subordinate based on such laughably weak evidence. Not only had Theo survived the White Tower, but there was also the bloody corpse of a noble servitor lying nearby, a feat accomplished by Theo himself. Julius wasn't about to ignore facts in favor of political accusations. Dante stubbornly continued pressing the issue like an angry child throwing a tantrum. Finally, Julius planted his foot firmly into the ground and warned everyone present that anyone who insisted on pushing this nonsense any further would be dealt with the ancient dragon style. The challenge immediately excited Dante. Fighting Julius was something he never objected to. Just as the two 9 dragons stood on the verge of exchanging catastrophic blows, Theo stepped forward and interrupted them. Raising his voice, Theo revealed that Jisar Ragnar had been defeated and abducted by the Trovan servitors. If they acted immediately, there was still a chance to catch up and rescue him. The moment the surrounding soldiers heard that an official succession candidate had been kidnapped, the mood shifted noticeably in Theo's favor. Theo calmly promised that he would answer every accusation of treason during a proper trial once the current crisis had been resolved. Right now, rescuing Jisar had to take priority over everything else. Watching the situation unfold, Evelyn believed even someone as reckless as Dante would surely place the safety of one of his own disciples above political games. She was completely wrong. Dante dismissed Jisar's situation entirely, claiming he didn't care about any of that. In fact, he had grown tired of all the talking. Rather than debate further, he'd much rather settle everything through force. Before we move ahead, please take a second to share on this video. Sharing helps this video reach friends who may also enjoy anime, gaming, travel, cricket, chess, career basics, or personal stories. Your support helps Amazing Abhai grow naturally. If Theo couldn't prove his innocence immediately, Dante looked perfectly willing to execute him where he stood. Knowing violence was only seconds away, Theo activated Dragonization and full view of everyone present. His aura surged upward as he openly condemned Dante's priorities, before asking a question loud enough for every soldier to hear. Which mattered more, the Ragnar family itself, or the throne Dante was so desperately obsessed with obtaining? As Theo's power continued rising, every pair of eyes became locked on his transformed body. Before the assembled soldiers, Theo further solidified his identity as the true descendant of the ancient dragon by summoning the images of his dragon guardians. Griffin, meanwhile, was thoroughly unimpressed at being used as political evidence. By combining Nirvana with the technique inspired by the glass domain, Theo had discovered a way to manifest the appearance of the guardians themselves. They looked every bit as majestic and mythical as the legends described, but Theo understood their limitations. These manifestations possessed appearance alone, not the overwhelming power necessary to restrain someone like Dante. That had never been the point. Theo wasn't trying to fight the tyrant dragon. His goal was simply to shift public opinion for a family whose entire identity revolved around dragons. Witnessing someone command the legendary guardians carried tremendous symbolic weight. The display worked exactly as intended. Soldiers from both cavalry divisions began cheering for the true descendant of the ancient dragon, and rallied behind Theo's proposal to rescue a fellow Ragnar first. Just as Theo succeeded in swinging the momentum toward himself, Dante stepped forward with a look of complete contempt. Seeing through the delusion immediately, he threw a single punch. The attack shattered Theo's imitation glass domain into countless fragments. One by one, the majestic dragon guardians dissolved alongside the broken illusion. Dante loudly mocked both Theo and the visions, making sure every soldier heard his words. He launched into an angry rant, calling the clan pathetic for believing childish fairy tales and allowing themselves to be fooled by cheap parlor tricks. Only after the words left his mouth did he realize what he'd actually said. By dismissing the guardians as nothing more than fake lizards, he'd also insulted the very legends the Ragnar clan had built its identity around. Or still, he had practically called the gathered soldiers gullible fools. Complete silence spread across the battlefield. Every pair of eyes slowly turned toward Dante, as though he had just humiliated himself beyond repair. Even the conservative elder dragon looked visibly offended after hearing dragons referred to as mere lizards. Theo wisely remained silent, allowing Dante to continue digging his own grave without any assistance. Simply by losing control of his temper, the tyrant dragon had exposed his true thoughts before the entire clan. The very legends he mocked might ultimately become the reason for his downfall. Realizing he had already crossed the line, Dante chose the worst possible response. Doubling down, he scoffed that if Theo's legendary guardians were truly so extraordinary, then surely they could survive one of his attacks. Theo hadn't anticipated just how irrational Dante really was. The tyrant dragon began launching an outright attack in front of everyone. Before the strike could fully land, however, the entire battlefield froze. Time itself seemed to stop, and overwhelming presence descended from above, instantly silencing every warrior present. A pure aura illuminated the entire battlefield, as though the heavens themselves had opened. The patriarch of the Ragnar clan, Theo Ragnar, had arrived. His first words echoed across the silent battlefield with crushing authority. He calmly questioned why his soldiers were pointing their weapons at one another, instead of returning with enemy heads. The moment they recognized the patriarch, every soldier immediately dropped to one knee in respectful greeting. Julius offered no excuses whatsoever. Dante, on the other hand, desperately tried to justify his actions, insisting he had only intended to punish a traitor. He pointed toward Theo, arguing that the young heir was dressed in the enemy's clothing and had stained the Ragnar name. For that reason alone, he requested permission to execute Theo immediately. Kyle barely spared Dante a glance. In an icy voice, he remarked that his dog seemed to have forgotten its place. A dog that barked so loudly in front of its own master, and even tried biting whoever it pleased, clearly needed discipline. Without moving a finger, an overwhelming pressure descended onto Dante's body. The tyrant dragon immediately buckled under the invisible force, collapsing toward the ground. Only after putting Dante firmly back in his place did Kyle turn toward everyone else and request a proper report. Among those present, Thorkel Ragnar was one of the few still capable of speaking under the Patriarch's suffocating aura. He reported that the fourth successor, Gisar Ragnar, had been abducted by Troivan forces. Supporting Theo's earlier proposal, Thorkel recommended forming a pursuit squad immediately instead of wasting precious time arguing over politics. Kyle listened before reminding Thorkel of what he considered an unshakable truth. The Ragnar clan existed under the law of the strong. Losers deserve death. Despite everything, Thorkel quietly admitted he still didn't want to lose a brother. If the family abandoned one of its own so easily, what kind of clan could they truly claim to be? Kyle immediately corrected him. Ragnar had never been a place for sentimental ideas about happy families. Theo then stepped forward and expanded upon Thorkel's argument, but from a completely different perspective. He wasn't asking them to save Gisar because they were brothers. If they abandoned Gisar now, they wouldn't merely lose a succession candidate. They would lose the fear, honor, and reputation associated with the Ragnar name itself. Their enemies needed to understand that laying even a single finger on a Ragnar warrior would bring consequences worse than death. Only by rescuing Gisar and crushing those responsible could the clan preserve the terror that kept the world from ever looking down on Ragnar. Dinte immediately dismissed Theo's reasoning as nothing more than clever sophistry, and once again tried dragging the discussion back toward accusations of treason. This time, Kyle's patience finally snapped. Without lifting a hand, he increased the crushing pressure once more, forcing Dante face first into the dirt. Calmly looking back at Theo, Kyle admitted he was impressed. Theo spoke about Ragnar honor, almost as though he were already the clan's future patriarch. It was an interesting excuse to achieve his objective, and one Kyle found worthy of entertaining. Accepting Theo's proposal, the patriarch immediately organized everyone present into multiple rescue squads and ordered them to recover Gisar without delay. As the soldiers hurried to carry out their new orders, Kyle quietly called for Theo to remain behind. There were matters the old man wished to discuss privately with his son. Watching their father openly favor Theo once again, Thorkel couldn't hide the complicated emotions crossing his face. Even so, he suppressed them, turned away, and rejoined his unit as the rescue operation officially began. Meanwhile, deep within Troivan territory, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Ain, the first servitor, found herself being violently held by the neck as Ed Troivan vented his fury. With complete disregard for her status, he swung her around like a ragdoll, and raged that she had returned empty-handed. Neither Theo Ragnar nor the ancient dragon's relic had been brought back, yet she still dared to stand before him alive, carrying nothing but a consolation prize. Ain calmly accepted the abuse without resisting. She explained that the sudden arrival of Ragnar's main force had completely disrupted the mission, making success impossible. In reality, however, that was only half the truth. The real reason she hadn't killed Theo was much simpler. She had become fascinated by him. To Ain, someone as extraordinary as Theo Ragnar was far too valuable to dispose of so early. Before we move ahead, please take a second to like on this video. A like tells me that you enjoyed this topic. Your support helps Amazing Up High grow naturally. After venting his anger with a few more blows, Ed finally stopped. There was no point dwelling on failure. The situation itself had already become disastrous. Without the ancient dragon's relic, the resurrection ritual simply couldn't be completed. Fortunately, the priest assisting the operation proposed an alternative. Among the handful of relics capable of replacing the original sacrifice, the dragon's sword ranked among the finest. Under normal circumstances, however, Ed would never consider using it. The weapon was intended for the Mad Dragon Emperor after his resurrection, allowing him to stand against Kyle Ragnar himself. Sacrificing such an invaluable relic during the ritual would significantly weaken their future plans. Unfortunately, circumstances were rapidly spiraling out of control. Reports arrived one after another that Ragnar's main force had launched an overwhelming offensive. They were tearing through Troivan's front lines faster than ever before, openly declaring that they were searching for their kidnapped successor. Ed found the situation difficult to believe. Based on everything he knew about Kyle Ragnar, the Patriarch should have simply dismissed Gishar's loss under the clan's brutal law of the strong. Instead, Ragnar's forces were risking everything to recover him. Not far away, Gisar Ragnar slowly regained consciousness. The moment he woke, he immediately began provoking Ed with his usual reckless attitude. Smirking through the pain, He confidently claimed his master and even his little sister were probably leading the rescue operation already. Rather than becoming irritated, the assisting priest quietly pointed out the reality of the situation. Discovering this headquarters was now only the matter of time. Even protected by the demonic cult's barrier, the hideout could only remain concealed for so long. Abandoning the base and retreating would preserve their lives, but it would also postpone the resurrection ritual indefinitely. Worse still, the ritual itself could only be completed within the northern territories. They had barely managed to secure a foothold at the edge of the frozen north. If they abandoned it now, there was no guarantee they would ever regain access to this land again. Forced into a corner, Ed made the difficult decision. If they no longer possessed the ancient dragon's relic, then they would substitute it by sacrificing Theo Ragnar alongside the dragon sword. It was a far inferior alternative, but with Ragnar's army closing in, they no longer had the luxury of choosing a perfect solution. Realizing exactly what fate awaited him, Jishar immediately began struggling and shouting, but his cries were quickly silenced. The demonic cult had no intention of delaying any longer. The resurrection had to be completed before the furious Ragnars broke through the defenses. The ritual itself was unimaginably brutal. Bound upon a grotesque altar, Jishar's body became a living sacrifice. Thick, fleshy tendrils erupted from the altar itself, piercing and tearing into him from every direction. Massive lacerations spread across his body as blood poured endlessly beneath the crimson sky. Piece by piece, his flesh was offered to the dead. Combining Ragnar blood with the dragon sword as the catalyst, Ed Troyevin forcefully initiated the resurrection ritual of the Mad Dragon Emperor, pushing history onto a path completely different from the one Theo remembered. While those events unfolded elsewhere, Theo experienced an entirely different kind of trial. Kyle Ragnar's idea of father-son bonding was anything but ordinary. With a single slash of his sword, the patriarch literally tore open the fabric of space and time itself, leading Theo through the opening. Kyle stepped into the void beyond, choosing this isolated dimension as the perfect place for a private conversation where no one could interrupt them. The instant Theo entered the gap between time and space, Lodbrok's soul instinctively appeared beside him. Feeling the abnormal environment, she immediately emerged to observe what was happening. Even she couldn't hide her astonishment. The things Kyle accomplished with his sword had long surpassed anything that could reasonably be called swordsmanship. According to Lodbrok, the current patriarch no longer resembled a human being at all. Kyle, however, had no interest in allowing an ancient ghost to eavesdrop on a family discussion. Barely glancing toward Lodbrok, he made his displeasure obvious. This space had been created specifically so he could speak privately with his son. It was no place for a remnant from a forgotten age. Simply through the force of his gaze, Kyle forcibly shut Lodbrok's Thundergate, severing her temporary connection to Theo's consciousness. The sudden interruption injured Lodbrok, while Theo himself winced from the resulting headache. Once again, he realized he had never truly understood the extent of his father's strength. Just how far ahead could the patriarch actually see? To Theo's surprise, Kyle asked a question that carried none of his usual authority. Calmly, almost solemnly, he asked whether Theo had ever resented him for the years of neglect, for allowing brothers to slaughter one another, and for ruling the Ragnar clan through absolute ruthlessness. The question caught Theo completely off guard. After a brief silence, he decided to answer honestly. He nodded rather than becoming angry. Kyle actually seemed pleased. He appreciated that Theo possessed enough backbone to answer truthfully instead of panicking and feeding him comforting lies. Extending one finger, Kyle casually demonstrated a fraction of the overwhelming strength required to support the very world itself. Throughout his entire life, he had accepted sacrificing the few for the sake of preserving the many. Ruthlessness wasn't a choice born from cruelty. It was the price of maintaining stability. Theo had heard stories describing Kyle as a relentless hunter of regressors. According to Kyle, that reputation was only half true. He hadn't hunted regressors simply because they regressed. He hunted those who threatened to plunge the world into chaos. It just so happened that most regressors became exactly that. The greatest source of chaos in history had been none other than Kyle's own father, the Mad Dragon Emperor. To preserve the clan in the world, Kyle had personally killed his own father. His hands were stained with the blood of family, so countless others could survive. As Theo quietly listened, he suddenly noticed something extraordinary behind his father's back. A magnificent halo floated there, eerily similar to the ones Theo had previously witnessed inside the Pantheon. At the same time, chains wrapped around parts of Kyle's body, binding him like invisible restraints. Kyle finally revealed the truth. The moment his strength surpassed the limits of humanity, he received a calling from beyond this world. Somewhere on a battlefield, existing on a far grander scale, he had been summoned. Yet he refused to leave Ragnar behind. To resist that calling, Kyle deliberately sealed much of his own strength. Every time he revealed more of his true power, the chains of fate tightened further around him. That was precisely why he governed through fear. By instilling absolute terror throughout the clan, he rarely needed to draw his sword. Fear alone maintained order. At this point, Kyle Ragnar was no longer merely human. He had become something far closer to a god, or perhaps a monster. Everything he had shown Theo today was simply meant to reveal the unbearable burden carried by the head of the Ragnar clan. Whether Theo could someday break those shackles and surpass destiny itself would depend entirely on him. Theo silently reflected on everything he'd learned. The truth was, he still didn't know whether the path he currently walked was truly the correct one. Activating Nirvana, he temporarily expanded his mental realm, sharpening his thoughts to their absolute peak. As the surrounding space itself trembled, Theo looked directly at his father and confidently declared that one day, the clan, the calling, and even the realm itself would all become his responsibility. After all, he wasn't aiming merely to inherit the position of family head. He'd intended to surpass Kyle Ragnar himself. Hearing those words, Kyle slowly smiled. The confidence was unbelievably arrogant, but that arrogance was exactly what he wanted to hear. Theo truly was his son. If that was the ambition he intended to pursue, then Kyle found one more reason to continue resisting the calling a little longer. From this day onward, he would watch Theo's every step. It would be up to his son to prove whether that overwhelming confidence was empty, bravado, or the truth. The conversation ended not as a lecture, but as an open challenge from the strongest man in the world to the successor who claimed he would one day surpass him. Out in the real world, Thorkel Ragnar and the Black Iron Cavalry kept expanding their search far beyond the areas marked on the map. But something felt seriously off. The deeper they searched, the stranger everything became. There wasn't a single person anywhere, not an enemy soldier, not even a trace of life. Then it finally clicked, and Thorkel instantly realized they had wasted precious time. Cursing himself for noticing too late, he sensed a faint disturbance in the empty air, and thrust his spear forward. The weapon struck something invisible, confirming his suspicion. The demonic cult had hidden their headquarters behind a massive mirage barrier. Without hesitation, Thorkel ripped the illusion apart, revealing the nightmare concealed underneath. A grotesque altar made entirely of flesh had exploded from within, covering the entire headquarters in tainted blood. The Ragnars immediately spread out and searched every inch of the blood-soaked ruins. Before long, the investigation confirmed their worst fear. They had found the shriveled remains of Lord Gisar Ragnar, his body completely drained of life. Refusing to believe it, Ansido Ragnar. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to Amazing Apai. Subscribing makes sure you do not miss the next video, and it gives me motivation to keep improving the quality of every upload. Thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next one.